Hello and welcome to the Unit 3.2 revision video. This is going to be all about the political impact of the Great Depression, but more specifically about the appeal of Nazism and communism, the use of their tactics, their fortunes, including the role played by propaganda. So first of all, as always, it's a good idea to write down what you already know. So in one colour, put down what you can remember about the appeal of Nazism and communism. Why did people vote for them? What was attractive about them? Write down if you can remember any statistics from the 3.1 video, all those kinds of things, and then you can add to it throughout the video, or you can try and do this activity again at the end just to see how much more you can remember and what areas you need to go back over a second time. Pause the video here to be able to do this. To begin with, we're just going to do a very quick reminder of the political impact of the Great Depression. Democracy, as we already know, after the fall of the Grand Coalition in March 1930 was effectively dead. The impact of the September 1930 election was profound, and we can't understate the importance of that election because it made the Reichstag unmanageable and allowed extremist parties to gain significant support. And by the time we get to July 1932, which is the really key election to make sure you know the results of, we have more than 51% voting for extremist parties, the KPD and the Nazis as well. So for instance, remember in that election, the Nazis have got 230 seats. That is their biggest that they have before Hitler becomes chancellor, and obviously the highest they ever get is after the Reichstag fire in March 1933, where they get 44% of the vote. Thinking about the communists do gain support until November 1932. Their highest ever was 16.9% of the vote, or 100 seats. So just a reminder that the political impact of the Great Depression was enormous. The stuff that we're going to be looking at in this video about the appeal of communism and the appeal of Nazism is very much still linked to the political consequences of the Great Depression. To begin with, we're going to think about the communists, we're going to think about their policies, ideology, the strengths and the weaknesses of what they did in this time period between 1930 and 1932. So first of all, thinking about their main policies, they wanted to do things like ending cuts to unemployment benefits, they wanted things like wages to increase, they wanted the legalisation of abortion, but they also talked about having close cooperation with the communist Soviet Union, the end of military spending and the establishment of a workers' state. Essentially, their main aim was overthrowing the parliamentary democracy of the Weimar Republic and creating this workers' state. Now, they even attacked other left-wing parties like the SPD as being damaging to the working class interests as the Nazi Party. They called them social fascists, and this was actually one of the really key weaknesses, that they wouldn't cooperate with other left-wing parties, and this then led to a divide in the left-wing vote. So let's think a little bit more about what they did on the next slide. So we're going to think about what is attractive about communism. Why did lots of Germans begin supporting the Communist Party? Because we can see they were steadily increasing their vote. From these statistics, we can see at the top here. So they didn't make the enormous gains that the Nazis did. They weren't able to appeal beyond their kind of traditional core supporters, but they still had lots of things about them that were attractive to many people. Now, first of all, the KPD party in Germany was the largest communist party in Europe and had 300,000 members by 1932. They'd even managed to gain over 2 million votes in the Reichstag elections between 1928 and 1932. They were a party that had created a clear identity with organisations which advanced the communist cause. So they had lots of different organisations, including the Red Front Fighters League, which remember is the military organisation of the Communist Party. The idea behind it is to try and show its physical strength in the brawls with groups like the SA, the Brown Shirts. But they also had as well things like the Young Communist League. The Young Communist League created recreational activities, especially for working class young people, and basically was a centre of political indoctrination for the young. They also, though, had things for women and women's organisations like the Alliance of Red Women and Girls, and they even had two newspapers that they used as propaganda, and they were called the Red Flag and the Workers' Newspaper. So essentially, the KPD was able to create an active party that was able to exploit the Depression, but only to a limited extent. They did things like creating committees of the unemployed, they staged hunger marches, and they also agitated against benefit cuts in order to try and gain support. So after 1929, they were relatively successful in kind of shifting their focus to be more about the unemployed, and those actions that we just mentioned here did have an impact on their votes. As we can see, it did steadily increase as a result of the Great Depression. They were also able to successfully, using propaganda, present themselves as the defenders of the working class against the Nazis. And obviously they were doing that through things like using their paramilitary group of the Red Front Fighters League. However, despite the fact that communism did appeal to some working class people in certain areas, we know that they weren't able to appeal to voters beyond their traditional core supporters. And that is in real stark contrast to the Nazis, who were able to win support against all classes, regions, and generations. And that is why they were kind of seen as a people's party at that point. The communists themselves never got more than 20% of the vote, and we can see it peaks at 16.9%, or you can put 17% in an exam, in November 1932 in those last elections before Hitler becomes chancellor in January. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes about the appeal of communism. We've already seen that the communists were appealing for lots of different reasons, but now we're going to think about their strengths and their weaknesses. Now, first of all, they were successful at using propaganda. They emphasised the class struggle, the smashing of the capitalist system, and their posters and ideas were attractive to lots of different people. If you go back a couple of slides, you'll be able to see some of the examples of their propaganda posters. But don't forget that they also had things like the Workers' Newspaper and the Red Flag, which they were able to use as significant instruments for propaganda. They also were effective at utilising the Great Depression to their advantage, and they made explicit appeals to the unemployed through their propaganda. For instance, lots of their posters emphasised bread and freedom, quite a similar message to the Nazis using work and bread, but it was successful. And don't forget that they did things like having lots of hunger marches for the unemployed as well, lots of things to try and win their support. And their votes did increase over time, as we can see from that table that we looked at on the last slide. By 1932, in the November elections, they also reached a peak of 16.9%. You can say 17 in an exam, and that is still quite significant for them at this point. Generally, a strength of theirs was that they projected this image that would appeal to its committed followers and to many of those whose situation had become desperate as a result of the Great Depression. Their numbers in terms of membership increased from about 117,000 to about 360,000. So they are pretty successful. And also, they are able to scare the middle classes. This shows us kind of to what extent they were quite popular with people, because they concerned lots of the middle and upper classes at this point, and therefore their ideas were clearly gaining enough traction to worry other people. However, we can't overstate their strengths and their successes. They were also crippled by lots of fundamental weaknesses as well. So first of all, they had wanted to get rid of parliamentary democracy. They wanted to have some kind of revolution, but they never came close to launching a revolution. The Spartacist uprising of January 1919 was essentially their best chance, and obviously we know that that was crushed relatively quickly. They also made some major mistakes. For instance, they spent a long time concentrating on fighting the SPD, the so-called social fascists, and that blinded them to the most serious threat, which was actually the Nazi Party. Now, it was crucial that they made this mistake of attacking the SPD, because essentially it divided the anti-Nazi forces at a crucial time when they should have come together. They also failed to attract support outside of the main industrial areas and had very little appeal amongst women, despite the fact that they had created the group the Alliance of Red Women and Girls. In terms of levels of support as well, 16.9% of the vote is the most they ever get, which is what they have in November 1932, which in comparison to parties like the Nazis is relatively small. We also mentioned about a strength being the fact that they increased the numbers of their members from about 117,000 to 360,000, but more than 50% of its new members in 1932 left within a few months. So it's really kind of more circumstantial that people are joining them, and often due to the Great Depression, rather than a general like for their policies. It also really struggled with being short of money, as the majority of its members were unemployed, and that wouldn't help them come to power in the future. And ironically, the stronger the KPD became, the more support the Nazis generated from other Germans. So it was a battle that they couldn't really win. As soon as they became more popular, their enemies grew a lot stronger. As soon as they gained a bit more support, their enemies grew stronger still. They essentially couldn't win here because the Nazis were able to kind of utilize communist strengths against them, and were able to convince people that they needed to vote for extremist parties like the Nazis in order to prevent the spread of communism. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes about the strengths and weaknesses. So the appeal of communism is quite a small bit of the course, and we've actually come to the end of the slides on what you need to know. The appeal of communism could come up in something about the rise of extremist parties in this period, or it could be used as a factor if you had to write generally about why the Nazis became more popular by 1932. If you want to make sure that you know the key facts for the appeal of communism, you can go into Teams and look at this very short answer test, the 12 questions that are about the appeal of Nazism. There are more questions on that test, but the rest are about the Nazis. So make sure that you know the answers to those 12 questions. Part 2 of this video is all about support for the Nazis. This is an area you need to know in greater depth to be able to prepare for future exam questions. Before we can begin thinking about why the Nazis were so appealing to German citizens in the early 1930s, we're just going to think about the statistics that you should hopefully be aware of about support for the Nazis. You can see from the graph how much their support of the vote and how much their proportion of the vote, increased over time. So you don't need to know all of these different statistics, but it's definitely worth knowing the few that I'm going to highlight for you on this slide. So first of all, remember that the Nazi Party were created in 1919 when they were originally called the German Workers' Party, and they hadn't started out with very much of the vote. In 1928, a key statistic to know is that they only had 2.6% of the vote, or 12 seats in the Reichstag. So it's up to you whether you're going to remember percentages or the seats, but you do need to know that statistic. It's important to be able to use in a question on the political golden age, but it's also really important to be able to use to show the impact of the Great Depression on extremist parties. In 1930, remember that Brüning called that fateful election in September 1930, where the Nazis were able to increase their vote to 18.3%, or getting 107 seats. July 1932 is the other election you need to know about. The Nazis here received 37% of the vote, or 230 seats in the Reichstag. Just remember whichever one feels best for you. And they ended up starting to run out of money by November, and also their attacks on Papen's government, the fact that Hitler wouldn't work with democracy and become the vice-chancellor, all led to the Nazis having a small dip in the vote, as you can see on that graph, and they went down to 33% of the vote, or 196 seats. And then after Hitler became chancellor, he tried to establish a dictatorship, as we'll look at when we do Unit 3.4. And the Nazis managed to get 44% of the vote, or 43.9%, with 288 seats in 1933. Now remember, you don't have to know all of those statistics, just knowing that those ones that I put in yellow is absolutely enough. If you can remember the ones for 1930, that would be amazing as well, but you only need to know the ones that are in yellow there. Pause the video here if you need to make notes about the support for the Nazis in elections. We're also going to be thinking about who supported the Nazis. We can see from those election statistics that as a result of the Great Depression, they go from having 2.6% of the vote, or 12 seats, to having 37% of the vote, or 230 seats, in July 1932. Now, we know obviously that their support rose drastically in that period. We can see that when it comes to election results. But who actually voted for them is a quite contentious issue. There's been lots of debate about this from historians about exactly who voted for this extremist party, because the election results tell us about the increased Nazi support, but they don't tell us who voted for whom. Historians' analysis of electoral support for Nazis from particular social or religious groups are normally based on comparing how well the Nazis did in certain areas and then trying to look at the religious or social composition in that area. Now, generally, we think about the fact that, for instance, if the Nazis got 37% of the vote, but they only got 25% in a strongly Catholic area, then we'd suggest, for instance, that they were less likely to win votes from Catholics. So historians often talk about how the Nazis gained most support from the Protestants because the areas in the north and east of Germany were often Protestant, and that is where the Nazis got the highest share of the vote. They were also generally rural communities and therefore farmers that were quite often voting for the Nazis, the Mittelstand, the lower middle classes, and also the general middle classes as well. So generally, it is quite difficult to identify exactly who voted for the Nazis, but we can tell that the Nazis had a lot of success, particularly with the Protestants, the farmers, and the middle classes. However, they were a party that had managed to successfully appeal to lots of different groups. For instance, the historian Fischer said that the Nazis enjoyed a degree of success in crossing class, regional, confessional, gender, and age barriers, which was unprecedented in German political history. Childers also talks about the kind of cross-group appeal, but talked about there being a unifying factor of the politics of anxiety. Essentially, they were supposed to be a party that was a catch-all party of protest who were united above all by profound contempt for the existing political and economic system. So we've got a couple of historians' views there. It might be worth picking one of them and deciding to write them down in your revision notes. Remember that you don't have to write down all of the quote, you can paraphrase it or pick out a short extract from it. For instance, if I was writing about Childers, I might only pick out the term politics of anxiety. So essentially, the Nazis were supported from lots of different groups, but from analysing the election results, we can kind of conclude that generally it was Protestants, farmers, and the middle classes. So why did these people vote for the Nazis? We're going to look at this diagram. It should already have in your exercise book. I'm going to go through what it tells us. So first of all, this centre circle that you can see in the middle is supposed to be the breakdown of German society into the different social groups in 1932. So for instance, you can see working class people made up 46% of German society. White collar workers, that's those people that worked in the offices, people that are often seen as being middle class, made up 12%, and the farmers making up 21%. Now what you can see in this outside circle is this is supposed to be the breakdown of Nazi voters. So it's supposed to be that essentially a third of their votes for the Nazis came from working class people. 21% of their votes came from the white collar workers, 18% of their votes came from self-employed, 12% from the peasants, and so on. Now, do remember that it is quite difficult for historians to look at this very accurately because they're having to make broad judgments about certain areas and looking at the kind of regional statistics in those areas. It's quite complex and it's not a perfect system. But we do know that the Nazis appealed to lots of different people, especially because they had that kind of politics of anxiety, as Childers says. They were this party of protest and they had lots of different messages that appealed to different people, and they adapted those messages accordingly. So for instance, we think about how did they try and win support for the workers? So with the workers, they were saying things like work and bread, and they were talking about things as well like buying German goods, because remember that the exports fell by 61%. They were trying to encourage people to buy German goods so that they could reduce the problems of unemployment in Germany. And obviously the Nazis liked quite a nationalistic agenda like that as well. So they were saying those kind of things to try and win their support. If we think about the white collar workers, now considering this is quite a small social group in Germany of only 12%, having 21% of the Nazis' votes coming from this area is actually quite significant. And these people were often kind of won over by the Nazis with, for instance, the promises to make mothers home workers, which lots of middle class women would have liked. And they also put things about fair day's pay for a fair day's work as well. They even did things as well, like promising that they would limit the amount of large department stores to help small business owners and things like that in order to try and please them. So you can see that in the ideas that they push forward for the self-employed. In terms of the farmers, they were also trying to win them over with things like offering fair prices, saying that they are going to restrict food imports to make sure that people are buying more German food and therefore helping them out. So you don't need to know everything that is on this slide. What you do need to be aware of is some of the ideas that were pushed forward in propaganda and how they targeted their messages at particular social groups. The Nazis always adapted their message. They always changed it in speeches depending on who they were speaking to try and make sure that they seemed like a party that represented everybody. So you can see some of their ideas that they push forward for certain groups round here, and you can see general things that they pushed for all groups at the top here about making Germany great, getting rid of reparations, destroying the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding the economy, getting rid of communism, all those things they push forward to every group. So pause the video here if you want to make some notes about who they were most successful with, or for instance why they were most successful with those groups. What kind of messages were they saying? On this slide here, there are some historians' views on who supported the Nazis and why. Feel free to pause the video here and to write down a couple of them, the ones that you think are the most memorable. Remember that this is really important to get those grade A's and A stars if you're aiming for that, but you don't have to remember really long quotes. You can paraphrase it, or you could pick out a very small little bit that you think is worth learning. Obviously, we've got 5 different quotes on the board here. You wouldn't need to know all 5. You know, it's unrealistic to expect yourselves to remember all 5. So maybe pick out the ones that you think are the most memorable. So we've now thought about the increasing levels of support for Nazis over time and about who supported them. You also need to know in detail about why did people vote for the Nazis? And there could be a question that will ask you about the increase in Nazi support up until 1932. So you do need to be aware of lots of different reasons. Now, some of those factors we've already covered in the video, things like the appeal of communism, but we've also got lots of others that are listed here. So as you're watching it, you might want to make some kind of spider diagram or a vision clock or Cornell grid, particularly about why did people vote for the Nazis, and we've got lots of different factors that we're going to be looking at. So first of all, the first reason for increased Nazi support was the appeal of Nazi ideology. There's a few slides on this, so just be aware that it's the same factor of appeal of Nazi ideology. So essentially, they had this attractive ideology that helped them gain support. We're going to talk about the features of it on the next couple of slides. That includes things like the power of the will, the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, National Socialism, the Führerprinzip, and aggressive nationalism. Essentially, historians talk about the Nazi ideology being a rather vague catch-all set of beliefs that was wide-ranging and a loose set of ideals that essentially allowed lots of people to see there being advantages of voting for them. So the strengths of it, well, it was designed to appeal to a broad mass of patriotic Germans who longed for national unity and revival and the end to the humiliation, economic weaknesses and political divisions associated with Weimar democracy. And perhaps the greatest success of it was the fact that it was able to present this nationalistic appeal that lots of people liked. However, there are lots of historians that are quite critical of Nazi ideology, that talk about the fact that it is completely unoriginal and that it was often contradictory and incoherent because they were trying too hard to appeal to too many different groups, and therefore they weren't actually kind of creating this kind of true sense of what they wanted to achieve. So if you were writing a paragraph about the appeal of Nazi ideology, you'd want to pick out at least a couple of examples of what they talked about and why this was appealing. So I'm going to go through some over the next couple of slides. Don't write them all down, but pick a couple once we've talked through it. So first of all, there was this idea of the power of the will. Hitler presented himself and the Nazis as a force for change in Germany, and that put them in stark contrast to the Weimar Republic that had shown themselves as being weak and chaotic, at least in the eyes of the German people. The SA also kind of furthered this image by presenting themselves with this image of discipline and unity that could sweep all opponents aside. So that's the first area of ideology. Another area is the Volksgemeinschaft. This was the idea of the people's community. And in the Nazi eyes, Aryans were the citizens and there should be no social classes. If you weren't an Aryan, the idea is that you weren't part of the German citizens and therefore you'd have less rights than them. And they put forward these ideas ever since their 25-point programme that Hitler wrote in 1920. The idea behind the people's community is that everybody would work for the good of the nation and that they would kind of create this old romanticized mythical German past before industrialization about blood and soil and about everybody working for the good of the land and being united in this kind of romanticized community from before. Now, it's up to you which ones you pick out, but Volksgemeinschaft is really important to future units when you're in year 13 and studying unit 5, so that might be a good area to make sure you've got some notes on. However, there were lots of different aspects of Nazi ideology. They also presented this idea of being a national socialism. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that even though the Nazis called themselves the National Socialist, ever since Hitler had changed their name back in the 20s, he used the word socialism very loosely in a way that might appeal to some of the working class voters. In his view, socialism and the Volksgemeinschaft were one and the same thing. He basically felt that socialism was about creating a people's community, not about actual socialist policies like the SPD were pushing. Another area of Nazi ideology was the idea of struggle and war. Now, for the Nazis, they believed that the struggle between races was part of the natural order of things. He was heavily influenced by this idea of social Darwinism, which he then changed into being something that was intended to justify future actions against ethnic minorities in Germany. Believed that war would be essential in helping to reconstruct German society and create a new Reich or empire through the conquest and subjugation of other nations, particularly in the East. And this is very much linked with that idea of Lebensraum, about creating living space in the East, because the Nazis felt that the people that were Slavs in the East were inferior. So as a result of this idea of struggle and war, Nazi propaganda therefore glorified the military, glorified groups like the SA, and talked all about courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice for the good of the nation or the people's community. Other areas of Nazi ideology to know about are some that we've got on the board here. The first one, and probably the most important one on here, is the Führerprinzip. Now, this is basically translated as the principle of leadership. The Nazis wanted to try and create a one-party state built on an all-powerful leader. This was central to their ideology, and it's what they create when Hitler starts a dictatorship by August 1934. It's about them wanting a strong authoritarian government, and this is something that is particularly attractive to lots of the people who haven't supported parliamentary democracy, from people who felt that proportional representation made Germany weak. It's very attractive to those people. And Hitler argued, and lots of people believed him, that parliamentary democracy encouraged the growth of things like communism. And so he talked about it being something that needed to be stopped, about it essentially being a weed that needed to be pulled out. And we can see his own ideas on democracy here through this quote, where he said that democracy is fundamentally not German, it is Jewish. So even back in April 1922, Hitler very much believed in the Führer principle, the idea of having a strong leader, which would obviously be him. Now, that idea was attractive to quite a lot of Germans. We can see that with the fact that the Nazis presented this very openly in their ideology. And remember that Hitler received almost 14 million votes, 37% of the votes, when it came to the presidential elections in April 1932. So this is an idea that did have mass appeal to the Germans, especially in a time of economic crisis. He also, in terms of his foreign policy, had an ideology of aggressive nationalism, where he wanted to do the following three things, which you might remember from GCSE, looking at international relations, how he wanted to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles, create a greater German Reich, create a great German empire that would last 1,000 years, including uniting all the German speakers together, and also gaining Lebensraum, or living space, in the East, which is linked to that previous one we looked at of thinking about this idea of kind of struggle and war. Now, a final area of Nazi ideology to be aware of is anti-Semitism, this idea that the Nazis portrayed Jews, obviously very wrongly, as being greedy, cunning, and motivated only by selfish motives. Hitler described them as being parasites, as being responsible both for the evils of capitalism with the amount of department stores and things they owned, but also responsible for the growth of communism as well. So essentially they were a scapegoat for the Nazis. So far we've just looked at about 6 or so aspects of Nazi ideology. Make sure that you've got some notes on a few of them at least, and that you can talk about why they were appealing to the German population, especially in the early 1930s. Now, the last one that we just mentioned was about anti-Semitism. And obviously this is part of Nazi ideology, but it's also a factor that we want to kind of consider on its own. And this is quite a controversial one. So you can see here I've put as a question, was this actually a reason for the increase of Nazi support? We've mentioned already that anti-Semitism was rife within the Nazi Party. They portrayed the Jews as responsible for all of Germany's problems, the problems of a capitalist society, the problems of increase of support for the communists. Anything was used to be able to blame the Jews. Now, how much anti-Semitism played a role in the rise of the Nazis is something that is hotly contested, but most modern historians have now discredited this idea and say it wasn't a crucial factor in the rise of the Nazis. They actually feel like it was relatively few voters that were influenced by anti-Semitism. So people have kind of looked at some evidence for this, and we've thought about the fact that the disapproval for such anti-Semitic propaganda was often set aside for promises of work and bread. So when we think about the Great Depression, we think about the increase in Nazi votes. Things like the slogans of work and bread were much more effective at winning support and votes rather than the anti-Semitic propaganda. They kind of ramped up the amount of anti-Semitic propaganda once they were already in power. Also, the SA, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, is seen as a key anti-communist group, but actually most of the members didn't join just because they were anti-Semitic. They joined because they wanted the other benefits of things like free food, having a feeling of comradeship, but also because they were anti-communist. So it's not necessarily anti-Semitism that is the driving force for Nazi support. Hitler actually spent more time in the lead up to him becoming chancellor stressing an anti-communist objective than he did kind of pushing forward this anti-Semitic objective. So actually, anti-Semitism is quite a controversial factor. Personally, I wouldn't actually bring this up in a question about why the Nazis had increased support unless it's already the factor that they mentioned. For instance, if they said anti-Semitism was the main reason for this growth in support for the Nazis, then you'd have to talk about it. But I would certainly not pick this as a main factor because it seems that many people voted in spite of anti-Semitism rather than because of it. Another reason for increased Nazi support is definitely because of the appeal of Hitler. Now, Hitler himself was central to the success of the Nazis. He had gained national publicity from the 1923 Munich Putsch, and he also used that time wisely to try and reflect on the political situation. He obviously decided that he didn't want to try and seize power by force, as he realised that wouldn't work even at a time when hyperinflation was going on and there was even less support for democracy. Instead, he'd made that decision while in prison that he would now use Weimar democracy to gain mass support rather than attempting another putsch. When he came out of prison after serving 9 months, he reorganised the party in 1925 and based it around the principle of the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. This is basically where Hitler gave himself power over policy and strategy, and it was chaos when he wasn't there, but when he was there, it proved how important he was to the Nazi movement. He provided them with charismatic leadership with his mission to try and build a new Germany. His ideas were infectious and inspiring to others, and his messages at the time gave people faith. This was an attractive commodity, especially amongst the despair of the economic crisis when the other party seemed to lack direction. He was also a powerful speaker and was noted for his timing, expression, and the content of his speeches, which impressed listeners. Remember that he was also able to kind of work out what he needed to say to particular groups of people, and he adapted the content of his speeches according to his audience. Along with Goebbels as well, he realised the importance of propaganda and therefore used it to target people-specific grievances. He was flexible in what he said to the German people, and as I mentioned earlier, he tailored his message to his audiences. He was also the key figure in the Nazi Party. He was the central rallying figure that gave the various groups within the party cohesion and also attracted wider support. He also was somebody with a good sense of opportunity and timing and driven by self-belief. For instance, the fact that he turns down the role of Vice-Chancellor a couple of times and says that he won't be part of any kind of coalition unless he has the responsibility of being Chancellor, of being the person in charge of day-to-day government. So if you get a question that is about why did the Nazis generate mass support, the appeal of Hitler is absolutely crucial. You know, lots of the things that he is doing, lots of their propaganda is something that is also being pushed forward by other leaders, by groups like the communists as well. But what makes the Nazis different is that they are led by a figure that has cross-party appeal, that seems to be somebody that could unify Germany. And we can see how popular Hitler was as an individual when we think about the fact that in the April 1932 elections, he had got 37% of the vote and almost 14 million votes for him to be the president, the head of state. So that gives us a bit of evidence about how appealing Hitler was to the German public. You know, even once the Nazis end up being in power after he's established a dictatorship, he is really popular personally, much more than the party is itself. So the appeal of Hitler is a crucial reason. Make sure you pause the video here and get some notes. The next factor that you need to know about for how the Nazis increased their support is about propaganda and organisation. Now there's a couple of slides of information on this. This is just slide 1. And please also bear in mind that propaganda is very much linked to a lot of the other factors that we're going to look at. For instance, the appeal of Hitler is linked to propaganda. You can see the importance of Hitler in this poster that says, "Hitler, our last hope." So Hitler was central to propaganda, but also we've got the individual Joseph Goebbels, who was also incredibly important to this. You'll see with this factor, though, there's lots of links to other ones, for instance, the impact of the Great Depression and also the appeal of Nazi ideology. So it's very difficult to separate the reasons why the Nazis gained support. It's the kind of amalgamation of these factors together that lead to those really high numbers of support. The Nazis managing to get 230 seats or 37% of the vote in the July 1932 elections. So first of all, with propaganda, we need to know this was a real strength of the Nazis. The voters that voted for them were not simply won over by the appeal of a radical ideology at a time of economic crisis, because other parties did offer similar messages. For instance, the Nazis are offering work and bread, and the communists are offering, according to their propaganda, bread and freedom. What made the Nazis stand out was this revolutionary political packaging, the way that they sold and presented their ideas that made people listen. The Nazis thought that propaganda was incredibly important, and we can see this from how Goebbels had said after the Nazis came to power that propaganda was our sharpest weapon in conquering the state. They believed it was so important to have a centralised propaganda machine, and that's why Goebbels was in charge of it from April 1930. But they also made sure that they churned out lots of local propaganda as well to make sure that they were appealing to as broad a range of people as possible. In their propaganda, they followed a simple rule, and that was that their messages needed to be brief and also kind of desirable. So, for instance, when you think about that slogan of work and bread, that's about them trying to make it seem that they're going to solve all the problems of the Great Depression with this simple message that people can remember. They often didn't go into any detail about what they were actually going to do if they came to power. That wasn't the tactic that they used in propaganda. It was simple messages, and it was simple ways that they described their enemies as well to try and convince people that they were the right ones. So, as Goebbels mentions here, propaganda should confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over, and this was highly effective. Within their propaganda, both local and national, they promised to restore hope and create a new national community for all Germans, a Volksgemeinschaft. They promised to replace the feeble Weimar system with strong leadership, the Führerprinzip. They concentrated on this simple message that the Weimar Republic was responsible for the economic depression, national humiliation, internal divisions, and all the problems, for instance, that had stemmed from the armistice. So the Nazis and their propaganda were therefore offering a vague but powerful vision of a greater Germany that was obviously incredibly appealing during the Great Depression. So propaganda had been used effectively by the Nazis since the Munich Putsch, but it's really things like the Great Depression, that kind of short-term trigger, that makes people listen to these messages that have always been in their propaganda. These levels of propaganda were paid for by lots of wealthy patrons and industrialists, people like Thyssen. Now, the idea here is that they are anti-communists, they are worried about the increasing support for the communists and a potential communist revolution, and therefore lots of people ended up funding it. For instance, people like Henry Ford as well. However, all of their propaganda wasn't just paid for by these wealthy organisations. It was also paid for from things like donations by the party members and also charges for meetings from ordinary members as well. So what did they spend this money on? Well, first of all, they put great effort into training speakers. They even had a Nazi training school to try and make sure that it wasn't just Hitler and Goebbels that they were relying on for these speeches. They wanted to have lots of people that could go to lots of different areas of Germany and present those same ideas in a forceful and charismatic way. So they ended up creating the school and trained 6,000 of them by 1933. They also used the money to try and create propaganda using the latest technology. For instance, using things like loudspeakers, films, and they even had Hitler flying by plane a lot to try and make him seem like he was some kind of statesman, some kind of powerful figure, as well as helping him to be able to make speeches all across Germany and therefore make all local communities feel valued. The Nazis also spent the money on their own newspapers, posters, leaflets, film shows, rallies and marches. There was the power of mass suggestion of things like the rallies making people feel like they now belonged to this united community, and that then appealed to other people as well who were particularly frustrated at the kind of divisions of Weimar. Goebbels therefore initiated a new approach of this constant propaganda that was specific to certain groups of people. Lots of historians have stressed the importance of propaganda and how it played on people's emotions, especially with things like the mass meetings and the rallies. However, not all historians agree on the importance of propaganda, and some historians, like Noakes, believe that there's actually been an excessive stress placed on the importance of propaganda, and it gave the excuse that the German people were manipulated. For him, he says it was more successful when it reinforced existing sympathies and feelings, and therefore it wasn't that the Nazis were creating new messages, but they were able just to kind of capitalise on existing anger and frustrations and existing views. So, different views on propaganda. If you haven't already, pause the video and make some notes from the last couple of slides, and also think, to what extent would you say propaganda was responsible for the Nazis coming to power? Another reason for increased Nazi support was the role of the SA and political violence. So just a bit about the background of the SA, the brown shirts, stormtroopers. They were formed in 1920, but officially formed and renamed the SA in 1921. Now, originally they were a fairly small organisation. They were the paramilitary group of the Nazis. And remember that in 1919 to 1921, the Nazis were a very small organisation that was only really present in Bavaria. However, by the time that we get to 1933, as a result of things like the Munich Putsch, but also because of the horrendous social and economic consequences of the Great Depression, they had 500,000 members by 1933, many of them very committed Nazis who were also suffering a lot under the Weimar government, who blamed them for the problems of unemployment and all those issues. So what did the SA do? How did they help the Nazis increase their support? Well, they did things like distributing propaganda leaflets. So we've got that link to propaganda from before. Remember, this is part of Nazi organisation, and therefore there are some links to propaganda and organisation from before. But they would also do things as well, like protecting Nazi meetings and trying to drive the hated communists from the streets. Now, in terms of their confrontations with the Red Front Fighters League, there was a lot more violence that happened between 1930 and 1932. It had largely subsided in the so-called golden years, with apparently only 50 deaths as a result of violence. But we can see how extreme it gets, because in July 1932 alone, there's nearly 100 deaths. Now, the Nazis are also helped by the SA because the whole idea of them is propaganda by deed. Now, what the Nazis are doing here is exploiting people's fear of communism. They are making it seem like they're the only people that can deal with this because they are determined to smash communism, unlike the so-called Weimar politicians who are letting the communists gain support in the Reichstag, who are allowing them to so-called become stronger. So a lot of people that were worried about a communist revolution were attracted to the Nazis acting decisively as they viewed it, them kind of carrying out these attacks on the Red Front Fighters League. It was something that was about, the Nazis showing that they were different. And there were a lot of people that wanted a more extreme solution to the communist threat. So despite the violence and disorder that the SA actually caused, the fact that they were willing to deal with the communist threat, the fact that they had lots of public disciplined marches, created this impression that the Nazis would provide firm government and help restore law and order to Germany. Now, they did suffer some setbacks, for instance, when political uniforms were banned by Brüning in December 1931 and when the SA itself was outlawed in April 1932. However, these methods to try and control them were unsuccessful, and despite the Weimar government's best attempts, the violence was not brought under control. Papen ended up ending the ban in an attempt to appease the Nazis. However, obviously, this was not something that was a long-term solution, and the Nazis end up basically creating a vote of no confidence in Papen and getting rid of him as chancellor. So the SA and political violence is another factor to be aware of. What I would do now is to make some notes on this as a factor, but also make some notes about your thoughts on this. Would you say that this was a crucial reason for the Nazis coming to power? Would you say that it was only a factor when you combine it with others? Would you say this is more about fear of communism rather than the strengths of the brown shirts? It's up to you what you argue, but pause the video here and jot down some thoughts. Another reason for increased Nazi support is Weimar governments and the impact of the Great Depression. This is an absolutely crucial reason that you can't ignore in a question about increasing Nazi support. This is the key factor that changes things from what they were like before in terms of support. If we think about things like the SA, they were there before the Great Depression. Propaganda, the organisation of the Nazis, anti-Semitism, their ideology, all of those things were around before. But the Great Depression is the thing that makes people respond to the Nazis positively, what makes them start listening to their messages that they're putting forward in propaganda, what makes them think that Hitler can lead Germany out of it when they vote for him in the presidential elections of 1932. So it's really important that you know that depression is absolutely crucial. There aren't any historians really that talk about it not being the kind of crucial factor that led to all of the other factors coming into play. So first of all, we know that there were multiple Weimar governments that failed as a result of the Great Depression. For instance, the Grand Coalition collapsed in March 1930, Brüning's government collapses, Papen's government collapses, and also Schleicher's. So think about what it was like to be a German, witnessing there being 3 different chancellors in 1932 alone, as a result of the fact that nobody could deal with the depression effectively. If we think about Brüning, he's the one that's most associated with the failure of Weimar governments to deal with the Great Depression, because he has the nickname of the Hunger Chancellor, because he cut expenditure and raised taxes at a time when the German people were desperate, when there were at least 6 million people unemployed. We can see the impact of the Depression and how it led to the Nazis coming to power, because it allowed the Nazis to make numerous gains in the elections. Before the Great Depression, the Nazis were a very small party. They only had regional support, really. They were one of many different right-wing groups, and they only had 12 seats in the Reichstag, or 2.6% of the vote. However, that election that Brüning mistakenly calls in September 1930 led to the Nazis getting a foothold, and they ended up being able to increase their support to 107 seats, or 18.3% of the vote. Between those 2 elections of 1928 and 1930, the Nazis gained 6 million votes because of the way that they used things like propaganda to exploit the situation to their advantage. Generally, the weak coalitions of the Weimar government is demonstrated by the fact there were 4 chancellors in less than 12 months. In the year of 1932 alone, so just that calendar year, there were 3 chancellors. But if we think about in 12 months, there are actually 4. So we have people like Brüning, then we have Papen, then Steicher, and then Hitler. So you can see the impact that this has. And you can imagine how people didn't like the so-called weak Weimar governments when they were constantly changing, and it represents the fact that they don't have this long-term stability. So the prospect of firm action to take Germany out of the economic and psychological depression made Nazism attractive to millions of worried Germans, regardless of class. However, this wasn't the only criticism of Weimar Germany. There were also other criticisms of the Weimar governments. For instance, the fact that they felt they were responsible for the Treaty of Versailles and that all of their problems essentially stemmed from this. So here, this is a really crucial factor to make some notes on. This provides some rational reasons as to why people voted for the Nazis at this point, because they were desperate, because they were looking for some kind of economic solution. They were looking for somebody to provide strong leadership to lead them out of the depression. And obviously the Nazis used the appeal of Hitler and his charismatic skills, and also they used propaganda to try and emphasize that they were going to be able to solve these problems. Even the fact that they had the SA provided this idea that they were a strong and organized force. So the depression is the kind of short-term trigger, but remember this is very much linked to making all of the other factors even more important, making the Nazis attractive in more ways because of the desperation. Pause the video here if you want to make some notes on this. Linked to the last factor is about the general unpopularity and the weaknesses of Weimar. Now, this isn't necessarily a reason why people voted for the Nazis, but it's certainly a reason why people lost faith in the government and why support for Weimar decreased over time. Now, if you want to know generally about the support for Weimar and attitudes towards the Republic, you can even go back and look at the Golden Age video for 2.3 Politics, and it talks you through there the fact that there were some positives with the support for the Republic, but that generally, pride was in short supply, and generally people basically supported it because they didn't feel like they had a better alternative. The Nazis obviously were portraying themselves as that better alternative. They were suggesting they would provide strong leadership. So weaknesses of Weimar, the unpopularity of the regime, is really a long-term reason. This isn't something that is new. There has been issues with support for the Weimar governments for a long time since it was created officially with the Constitution in August 1919. So first of all, there are some historians that say the people of Germany might have been actually more willing to let the government try and deal with the economic problem if they hadn't been so scarred from hyperinflation in 1923. So maybe that was a long-term cause of people deciding to vote for extremist parties because they'd lost faith in their government being able to deal with economic problems. Also, there were a lot of people that blamed the Weimar governments for signing the armistice and therefore stabbing the army in the back. That still wasn't forgotten. That was still associated with being the November criminals that had also done things like signing the Treaty of Versailles and doing subsequent deals with the Allies that they felt were humiliating, things like the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. For a lot of Germans, all of their problems stemmed from Versailles, and therefore they blamed the government for signing it, even though in reality we know they had no choice. Other reasons why Weimar was so weak is this idea that the constitution, when it was created, didn't go far enough to kind of change German society. It's that whole idea again of being a republic without republicans, of them not changing these key figures in the army and key figures in the judiciary, essentially them leaving powerful people in these positions who were not supportive of the Republic. And lastly, we've got as well about things like the weaknesses of proportional representation. This was a key issue because it created these weak coalition governments. You know, imagine being a citizen in Weimar Germany and watching so many numerous governments collapse, sometimes over really important reasons and sometimes over things like the flag, for instance, Luther's government in 1926. So generally there wasn't that much support for Weimar, and potentially, you know, if they hadn't been unpopular for this period of time because of their association with, you know, the weaknesses of the constitution, Versailles, hyperinflation, if they hadn't been associated with all those problems, they might have been able to weather the storm of the Great Depression, but this essentially weakens their position to be able to deal with it. So essentially they've been tainted with this poor reputation from the beginning. So think about to what extent you would suggest this is a reason for Hitler becoming chancellor or the Nazis gaining lots of support. Would you say it's as important as the other factors, or would you say it isn't? Make some notes on this and think about your argument. I'm not going to put loads of information about this, but just to be aware, if you are doing an exam question about why the Nazis got more support, you can actually do a section or at least a paragraph on the fear of communism. You know, you can use those statistics from the beginning of the video where we looked at the communists gaining lots of support and getting their highest ever percentage of 16.9% of the vote in November 1932. You could think about how this led to the Nazis being able to get more funding for their propaganda from rich anti-communists. And you can also think about how the communists gained more support as a result of the Great Depression and how that accidentally for them led to the Nazis gaining more support as they grew stronger. So if you want to, you could pause the video here and make some notes about how fear of communism was a factor. That would definitely be worth doing. So just to bear in mind an important note before we get to the end of this video. So it's important to understand that increasing support helped Hitler come to power, as he would never have been offered the role of chancellor if he didn't have the significant support of the German people. However, this wasn't the only reason why he became chancellor. It wasn't just his popularity. Remember that in the Weimar system, the person that picks the chancellor is not the people, it is actually the president. And therefore, it's the backstairs intrigue and the deals and decisions made by the elites, people like Hindenburg, Papen and Schleicher, that lead to Hitler being offered the role of chancellor. They would have never done it without the growth of support for the Nazis, but they essentially are both important, and you cannot talk about them being mutually exclusive. They are very, very much linked. There's going to be more on this on the next slide. So you have to be able to identify what different exam questions are actually asking you when it comes to Unit 3. Now, in an exam, they could ask you about the factors or events that led to increasing support for the Nazis, or they could ask you a question about who helped Hitler come to power. So for instance, in red here, we can see an example that is about the factors or the events, the things that we focused on in this video. For instance, they could say, the impact of the Great Depression was the prime reason for the emergence of the Nazis as a mass movement between 1929 and 1932. And in that answer, you would talk about the Great Depression. Hopefully you would have at least 2 paragraphs on that factor. And then you would also talk about other reasons. For instance, things that we thought about in this video, like the appeal of Hitler himself, propaganda and organisation, the SA, fear of communism, whatever it is that you wanted to talk about. But that's not the only type of question they can ask you. They can also ask you a question about who helped Hitler come to power. For instance, here's an example. Von Schleicher was primarily responsible for Hitler becoming German Chancellor in January 1933. Assess the validity of this view. Now, to answer a question like that, you'd have to watch the 3.3 revision video, because that talks about the roles of different people and the backstairs intrigue that led to Hitler being offered the role of Chancellor. So bear in mind that these are 2 questions which might sound quite similar because they're both about either Hitler becoming Chancellor or him getting enough votes to then become Chancellor. they're actually asking very different things. So you need to be very clear about which questions they're asking about factors or events, the kind of things that we've looked at in this video here, or if it's a question about who and the backstairs intrigue, and that would be something that we'll cover in the next video. So there is some information that you can use in both types of questions, but it's really important that you identify what each question is asking you and make sure that your focus is on that. We've now got to the end of the video. Earlier I mentioned about the questions to do with the communists that are in the 3.2 short answer test. There are also 15 questions about the Nazis if you want to go through and make sure that you know that key information that's covered on those tests. As a final thing, if you want to still do something to help you revise this content, remember that you could make some kind of detailed revision material, Cornell grid, revision clock, mind map, something like that. You could even try and do some kind of red pen, black pen activity to make sure that you've actually taken in a lot of information from this video. It's been quite intense, it's been quite a lot to know. If there's any areas it's still a bit weaker on, you could either watch those certain sections again, or you could even watch it without the sound on and just try and make some kind of revision material. And the best thing you could do after watching this video is actually to plan out an exam question. So here's a nice easy one about Hitler's leadership was primarily responsible for creating a mass Nazi movement in the period 1929 to 1932. Feel free to have a go at planning that out, and remember that I'll give you any feedback on any exams that you give me.